Welcome back. I've got a special story to share today.
Is that a knockoff? Julian Vance sneered, fingering Elena's collar in front of the dinner guests. Elena Vance didn't flinch. She stood perfectly still in the center of the marble foyer, the weight of the chandelier light pressing down on her like a physical burden. Around them, the elite of the city paused, champagne flutes frozen halfway to their lips. The string quartet in the corner seemed to dip into a frantic, dissonant staccato as Julian's laugh echoed off the high ceilings of the estate. "It's vintage silk, Julian," she said, her voice a calm, low anchor against his rising tide of arrogance. He didn't listen. He never did. He adjusted his own bespoke tuxedo jacket, the diamond on his pinky ring catching the light with a predatory glint. He smelled of cloying sandalwood cologne and expensive tobacco, a scent that had come to represent every lie he'd ever told. Vintage, that's just a polite word for trash, isn't it? Julian turned to the crowd, spreading his arms wide to invite their participation. My sister, the great ghostwriter. She spends so much time living in other people's lives that she's forgotten how to dress for her own. Tell me, Elena, does the person whose book you're currently polishing know you're wearing their hand-me-downs to my gala? Clara Vance, Julian's wife, let out a sharp, tinkling laugh from behind a manicured hand. She leaned into Julian's side, her eyes scanning Elena with the clinical coldness of a jeweler looking for a flaw. Now, Julian, don't be cruel. Not everyone can handle the pressure of the Vance name. Some people are just born to be. Background noise. Elena glanced toward the bar, where Beatrice Vance sat. Their mother was nursing a gin and tonic, her gaze fixed firmly on the ice cubes in her glass. She was the matriarch of a crumbling empire, a woman who had spent 30 years perfecting the art of looking away when her son drew blood. She didn't offer a word of defense. She simply took a slow, deliberate sip, her silence a heavy, suffocating endorsement of Julian's cruelty. "I'm not background noise, Julian," Elena said, her fingers grazing the small, silver key tucked into the hidden pocket of her clutch. It was cold, a sharp contrast to the stifling heat of the room. "I'm the one who makes sure the story makes sense." Julian's face twisted into a mask of faux concern. He stepped closer, invading her personal space, the smell of his cologne becoming an assault. "Is that what you tell yourself? You're a ghost, Elena. You live in shadows because you aren't bright enough to stand in the sun. You're lucky I even let you stay in the guest house. If it weren't for my generosity, you'd be writing your little stories on a park bench." He leaned in further, his voice dropping to a hiss meant only for her. "Don't ever think you're my equal. You're an employee of this family, nothing more." He pulled back, his public smile returning like a flicked switch. He signaled to a passing waiter, grabbing a fresh glass of champagne. "Actually, I have a special announcement for everyone tonight. Since we're all here to celebrate the rebirth of the Vance fortune, I've decided to clear out some of the dead weight." A murmur of curiosity rippled through the guests. Marcus Thorne, a longtime family friend and the only person in the room who didn't look at Elena with pity, stepped forward. His brow was furrowed, his hand resting instinctively on the lapel of his coat. "Julian, perhaps this isn't the time." "It's the perfect time, Marcus," Julian declared, his voice booming. "Tomorrow I'm putting the Vance library up for private auction. All those dusty first editions, the mahogany shelving, the history. It's all going. It's a relic of a past we don't need anymore. We need liquidity. We need the future." The room went silent. The library was the heart of the estate, the one room their father had truly loved. Elena felt a sharp, cold spike of rage pierce through her practiced calm. She looked at Julian, really looked at him, and saw the hollow, desperate gambler hiding behind the designer labels. He had embezzled the family's last liquid assets months ago. He thought selling the library would buy him another year of pretending to be a king. "You can't sell the library, Julian," Elena said. It wasn't a plea. It was a statement of fact. Julian laughed, a harsh, jagged sound. "I'm the head of this house, Elena. I can sell the floor you're standing on if I feel like it. Now be a good little ghost and go find some more wine. You've had enough attention for one night." He turned his back on her, dismissing her with a wave of his hand as he began to regale a group of investors with the projected profits of the auction. Elena didn't move. She watched him for a long moment, her hand tightening around the silver key. She thought of the documents she'd spent the last 6 months quietly securing. She thought of the debts she'd bought up under a dozen different shell companies, and the way the Vance name was currently tethered to her own signature in ways Julian couldn't even imagine. She turned and walked toward the quiet hallway that led to the library, her heels clicking a steady, rhythmic beat on the marble. Marcus Thorne caught her eye as she passed, a silent question in his gaze. Elena didn't stop, but she gave him a single, microscopic nod. She reached the heavy oak doors of the library and stepped inside, the scent of old paper and beeswax greeting her like an old friend. She pulled out her phone and dialed a number she knew by heart. "It's time," Elena said when the call was answered. "He's going for the library. Start the transfers. I want every single one of his personal lines of credit frozen by midnight." She hung up and looked at the rows of books, her father's legacy. Julian thought he was the master of this house. He thought he could humiliate her and sell her history to pay for his sins. He had no idea that the ghost had already changed the locks. The next morning, the sun bled through the tall, arched windows of the Vance dining room, casting long, sharp shadows across the silver tea service. Elena sat at the far end of the mahogany table, her fingers tracing the delicate, chipped rim of a teacup that had belonged to her grandmother. The Earl Grey was lukewarm and tasted faintly of copper, but she drank it anyway, her eyes fixed on the heavy oak doors. Julian strode in 5 minutes later, the scent of expensive sandalwood aftershave preceding him like a warning. He wore a navy silk robe that cost more than a mid-sized sedan, his hair perfectly coiffed even at 8 in the morning. He didn't look at her as he pulled out the chair at the head of the table, the wood scraping harshly against the marble floor. "Still wearing that charcoal sweater, Elena?" he asked, his voice dripping with casual cruelty. "It looks like it was woven from the lint of a better era. You're a ghostwriter, after all. Try to act like a ghost, unseen and unheard." Clara Vance entered behind him, her eyes glued to a tablet. She didn't offer a greeting, merely slid into her seat and signaled for the maid. "The florist called," she said, her tone bored. "They said there was an issue with the card on file for the centerpiece delivery for tonight's dinner." Julian Vance waved a hand dismissively, though his jaw tightened. "A clerical error. I'll have my assistant handle it. Mr. Sterling is coming at noon to appraise the library, and I want this house looking like a palace, not a dusty museum." He turned his sharp gaze back to Elena. "And you, stay out of the library. Your sentimental attachment to those moldy books is a liability I won't tolerate today." "Those books belong to Father," Elena said, her voice a calm, steady anchor against his rising tide of arrogance. "Father is dead, and his legacy is currently costing me 6 figures a month in maintenance," he snapped. He reached for his phone, his thumb hovering over the screen. "I'm selling the collection as a set. Sterling has a buyer in Dubai who doesn't care about history, only the prestige of the Vance name." The front door opened, and the heavy tread of boots echoed in the foyer. Marcus Thorne appeared in the doorway, his expression unreadable. Julian had hired him to oversee the security of the transfer, unaware that the man's true loyalty had shifted weeks ago. "The transport crates have arrived, Mr. Vance," Marcus said. "Good. Get them staged in the hall," Julian commanded. He looked back at his phone, his brow furrowing as he attempted to authorize a wire transfer for the insurance bond. He tapped the screen repeatedly, his frustration mounting. "This damn network. Clara, is the Wi-Fi down again?" "It's fine on my end," she replied without looking up. Elena took a slow sip of her tea. She felt the weight of the phone in her pocket, the device that held the confirmation of his financial decapitation. By now, every one of his personal lines of credit was a digital corpse. He was a man standing on a glass floor, and he was currently hammering at it with both heels. Beatrice Vance drifted into the room then, looking smaller than she had the day before. She reached for a piece of toast, her hand trembling slightly. "Julian, dear, are we really selling the first editions? Your father spent 40 years. Mother, be quiet, Julian barked, the sound like a whip crack in the quiet room. Your sentimental lifestyle is exactly why we're in this position. If you want to keep living in this house, you'll let me handle the assets. The color drained from the older woman's face. She looked down at her plate, her shoulders hunching. Elena's grip tightened on her cup until her knuckles turned white. The rage was a cold, hard coal in her belly, but she didn't let it flare. Not yet. Julian's phone suddenly began to vibrate. He answered it with a smirk, expecting his banker to apologize for the glitch. This is Julian Vance. Yes. What? What do you mean indefinite freeze? His voice rose, the mask of the composed aristocrat slipping. That's impossible. Check the primary account. There's over 3 million in. He stopped, his eyes darting to Elena for a split second before he turned his back to the room. Listen to me very carefully. If this isn't resolved in the next 10 minutes, I'll have your job. He hung up, his face flushed a deep, angry crimson. He turned to Marcus, trying to regain his footing. Thorne, tell the transport team to wait. There's a delay with the paperwork. Actually, Marcus said, his voice low and professional, Mr. Sterling just pulled into the driveway. He's early. Julian froze. He looked at the library doors, then at his dead phone, then back at Elena. She set her teacup down with a deliberate, final clink. Big day, Julian, she said, her voice like silk over steel. I hope everything goes exactly as you've planned. The doorbell rang, a sharp, demanding sound that echoed through the hollow halls of the estate. The countdown had reached 0. 2 days later, the air inside the Vance estate remained thick with the scent of Julian's desperation. The disastrous meeting with Mr. Sterling had ended in a flurry of excuses and a hasty exit that left the family's reputation tattered. Julian had spent the 48 hours since then pacing the hallways like a caged predator, his footsteps a frantic rhythm against the polished oak floors. Elena Vance stood in the shadow of the grand staircase, watching her brother. He was currently berating a terrified maid because his favorite silk tie hadn't been pressed to his exact specifications. It was a pathetic display of a man trying to exert control over a world that was rapidly dissolving beneath his feet. I don't care if the iron is broken. Julian's voice cracked with a high-pitched, jagged edge. Buy a new one, buy the whole store. Do you have any idea who I am? I am the head of this household, and I will not be seen in wrinkled silk. He dismissed the girl with a sharp wave of his hand, his face a mottled purple. When he turned and saw Elena, his expression shifted from rage to a cold, oily sneer. He adjusted his cufflink, a heavy gold piece that Elena knew he'd likely stolen from their father's private collection. Still lurking in the corners, Elena? He asked, his voice dripping with the familiar contempt that had been her daily bread for years. I'd think you'd be upstairs packing. After the Sterling misunderstanding, I've had to make some hard choices. This house is far too large for a failed writer who contributes nothing but silence. Elena didn't flinch. She felt the cool weight of a small silver key in her pocket, the key to a private vault Marcus Thorne had secured for her that morning. The Sterling meeting wasn't a misunderstanding, Julian. It was a revelation. He saw exactly what was behind the curtain. Julian took a step toward her, invading her personal space. He smelled of expensive scotch and the sharp, metallic tang of anxiety. What he saw was a temporary liquidity issue, one that will be solved by the end of the week. Mother has already agreed to sign over the remaining Vance holdings in the city. Once those are liquidated, I'll be back on top, and you'll be a memory. Beatrice Vance hasn't signed anything yet, Elena said, her voice a calm contrast to his frantic energy. She will, he hissed. She does what I tell her. Unlike you, she understands the importance of the name. Now, get out of my sight. I have a gala to prepare for, and I won't have your dreary presence dampening the mood. Elena watched him stomp toward the library, the heavy doors slamming behind him with a sound like a gunshot. She waited until the echo died down before she turned and walked toward the back entrance of the estate, where a black sedan was waiting. 10 minutes later, she was sitting in the back of the car, the city lights blurring into long streaks of neon against the rain-slicked window. Marcus Thorne sat beside her, his face illuminated by the glow of a tablet. The interior of the car smelled of rain, and the faint, comforting scent of old books that always seemed to follow Marcus. "He's moving faster than we anticipated," Marcus said, handing her the tablet. "Julian tried to bypass the board this afternoon. He attempted to authorize a private sale of the Vance Gallery's primary collection. He's looking for a quick cash infusion before the Founders Gala on Friday." Elena scrolled through the documents. Her eyes narrowed as she saw the forged signatures. Julian wasn't just gambling with the family's future anymore. He was committing felonies in broad daylight. Did he succeed? "No," Marcus replied, a grim smile touching his lips. "I blocked the transfer. I informed the gallery that the titles are currently under legal review due to an anonymous tip regarding the estate's solvency. He's cornered, Elena. He's going to the gala hoping to find a private buyer who doesn't ask questions." Elena handed the tablet back. She reached into her bag and pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope. Inside was the final forensic audit Marcus's team had completed an hour ago. It was the weapon, the undeniable proof that Julian had not only embezzled $3 million, but had also systematically drained their mother's private accounts to pay off offshore creditors. She ran her thumb over the embossed seal on the folder. The paper felt heavy and cold. This wasn't just a document, it was the end of Julian's world. "The gala is in 48 hours, Elena said, her voice steady. "He's invited the entire board, the city's elite, and every major investor we have left. He thinks it's his coronation. He thinks he's going to announce a new partnership that will save the Vance legacy." "And what are we going to announce?" Marcus asked. Elena looked out the window as they pulled up to a discreet law office on the edge of the financial district. "We aren't going to announce anything, Marcus. We're going to let him do it. We're going to let him stand on that stage, in front of every person he's ever lied to, and let him tell his last story." She stepped out of the car, the cold rain misting against her face. She felt a strange sense of peace. For years, she had been the ghost, the silent observer of her brother's cruelty. She had watched him dismantle their father's life piece by piece, all while mocking her for her little stories. As she entered the building, she checked her phone. A message from Clara Vance popped up. "Julian is selling the jewelry. He took the heirloom emeralds from the safe." "Elena, what do I do?" Elena didn't reply. She didn't need to. The countdown had already begun, and Julian was currently tying the noose around his own neck, convinced it was a victory sash. "2 days, Marcus," Elena whispered as the elevator doors closed. "In 2 days, the story finally ends." The morning before the Vance Foundation Gala, the manor was a hive of frantic, hollow activity. Florists lugged in crates of white lilies that smelled of funerals and high society artifice, while caterers argued in the kitchen over the temperature of the vintage Bollinger. Elena Vance stood at the top of the grand staircase, her hand resting lightly on the cold marble banister. She felt a strange, detached clarity. For years, this house had been a cage of silence, but today, every floorboard seemed to hum with the electricity of a coming storm. She found her brother in the library, the one room in the house that still held the faint, comforting scent of their father's old pipe tobacco. Julian Vance was not reading. He sat behind the massive mahogany desk, a glass of amber liquid already sweating onto the wood despite the early hour. He didn't even look up as she entered. He was too busy staring at the contents of a small, velvet-lined box. The Vance emeralds. He tossed the box onto the desk with the casual indifference of a man throwing away a candy wrapper. The stones, deep and green as a poisoned sea, spilled across the blotter. Each one represented a generation of history he was currently dismantling to pay off a bookie in Macau. "You shouldn't have taken those from the safe, Julian," she said, her voice like a thin blade of ice. "Those belong to the estate. They belong to Mother." Julian finally looked at her, his eyes bloodshot and rimmed with a familiar, frantic arrogance. He let out a sharp, jagged laugh. "Mother is a relic who doesn't know what day it is, and you're a ghostwriter who spends her life hiding in other people's shadows. I'm the one actually doing something. I'm the one keeping the Vance name from the gutter." The audacity of the statement made the air in the room feel thin. Julian was the gutter. He was the leak in the ship, yet here he was, blaming the sea for the sinking. "I'm selling them to a private collector this afternoon," he continued, leaning back and adjusting his silk tie with a smirk. "The proceeds will cover the shortfall in the Foundation accounts before the board meeting tomorrow. By the time anyone notices they're gone, I'll have doubled the money on the Phoenix merger." "There is no Phoenix merger," she said softly. Julian's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second before his ego surged back, doubling down on the lie. "That's because you don't have the clearance to know about it. Stick to your little stories, Elena. Real men handle the assets. You just make sure you wear something that doesn't make us look like we're in probate tomorrow night. I won't have you embarrassing me in front of the donors looking like a pauper." Clara Vance stood in the doorway, her face pale, her fingers twisting the strap of her designer handbag. She had been watching them, her eyes darting between her husband's trembling hands and Elena's unsettling, motionless composure. She noticed the way her sister-in-law didn't flinch, didn't argue, and didn't plead. It was the confidence of someone who already knew the ending of the book. "Julian, maybe we should listen to her," Clara whispered, her voice trembling. "The emeralds. They're the last thing we have. Get out, Clara," he snapped, the sharp, metallic click of his desk drawer closing punctuating his rage. "Both of you, I have calls to make." Elena didn't move immediately. She looked at the emeralds on the desk, then met her brother's gaze. "Be careful, Julian. Some things can't be sold twice, and some stories, once they start being told, can't be stopped." He waved her off with a dismissive flick of his wrist, already reaching for his phone. He didn't see her touch the small digital recorder in her pocket, or the way her thumb traced the edge of the audit documents she had secured an hour ago. She turned and walked out, her heels clicking a rhythmic funeral march against the hardwood. As she passed Clara in the hall, she didn't stop, but she did lean in close. "Tomorrow night, Clara," she whispered. "Make sure you're standing near the stage. You won't want to miss the opening act." Elena stepped out into the crisp morning air, checking her watch. 24 hours remained. Julian was currently convinced he was the master of the house, unaware that the very walls were closing in. She pulled out her phone and sent a 3-word message to Marcus Thorne. The bait's taken. The trap was set, the evidence was locked in a secure server, and Julian Vance was currently polishing the very pedestal he was about to be pushed from. Elena felt no guilt, only the cold, hard satisfaction of a writer finally reaching the climax of her most important work. Tomorrow, the ghost would finally speak. The evening of the Vance Foundation's Golden Jubilee arrived with a stifling humidity that even the estate's industrial-sized air conditioners struggled to suppress. By 7 o'clock, the grand ballroom was a sea of shimmering silk and sharp tuxedos, the air thick with the cloying scent of forced gardenias and expensive, musky colognes. Elena Vance stood near the arched entrance, her fingers grazing the cool, velvet clutch that concealed a small, silver USB drive. It felt heavier than it was, a lead weight of truth in a room built on gilded lies. She watched the crowd through the lens of a stranger. These were the people who had toasted her father's success, and then looked the other way when Julian began his systematic dismantling of the family legacy. Elena smoothed the fabric of her navy gown, a dress that was elegant but intentionally understated. She wasn't here to shine. She was here to be the shadow that eclipsed the sun. "You look like you're bracing for a storm," a low voice murmured beside her. Elena didn't need to turn to recognize Marcus Thorne. He stood a respectful distance away, a glass of untouched, sparkling water in his hand. His presence was a grounding wire in the electric atmosphere of the ballroom. "The clouds are already here, Marcus," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm just waiting for the first bolt of lightning." "The AV team is in place," he said, his eyes scanning the room as if checking for security threats. "The server is primed. Once he plugs in his vision for the future presentation, the script switches. There's no manual override from the podium." Elena nodded, her gaze shifting to the center of the room. Julian Vance was holding court near the crystal punch bowl, a glass of 20-year-old scotch gripped in his hand like a scepter. He looked every bit the conquering hero, his laughter booming over the polite hum of the string quartet. He was surrounded by a phalanx of investors, men who smelled of leather and ego, all nodding at his every word. As if sensing her eyes on him, Julian turned. His smirk widened, and he excused himself from the group, weaving through the crowd with a predatory grace. He stopped just inches from Elena, the scent of peat and arrogance radiating off him in waves. "I didn't think you'd actually show up, Elena," he said, his voice dripping with a mock sympathy that made her skin crawl. "I thought you'd be at home, perhaps drafting a polite little poem about the good old days while the adults handle the real business." "It's an important night for the family, Julian," she said, her voice a flat line of composure. "I wouldn't miss it for the world." He leaned in closer, his eyes darting to her modest jewelry. "You know, the board was asking why you aren't on the program. I told them you preferred the quiet life, that you didn't really have the temperament for leadership. It's a shame about that dress, though. It looks like something Beatrice would have worn to a funeral 30 years ago. Then again, maybe that's appropriate. You're mourning a version of this family that doesn't exist anymore." He didn't wait for a response, patting her shoulder with a condescending heaviness before turning back to his admirers. It was a calculated public dismissal, and Elena felt the heat of a few nearby stares. She didn't flinch. Instead, she felt a cold, sharp spark of satisfaction. He was so blinded by his own perceived brilliance that he couldn't see the edges of the pit she had dug for him. Across the room, Beatrice Vance sat in a high-backed velvet chair, looking like a porcelain doll that had been cracked and glued back together. She was nodding absently as Clara Vance leaned over her, whispering something urgently. Clara looked pale, her eyes darting toward Elena with a mixture of terror and dawning realization. She had seen the ghost in the hallway the day before, and the haunting was clearly beginning to take hold. The chime of a silver spoon against a crystal glass rang out, cutting through the chatter. The lights in the ballroom dimmed, and a spotlight found the mahogany podium at the far end of the room. "It's time," Marcus whispered, stepping back into the shadows. Elena moved toward the side of the stage, positioning herself near the heavy velvet curtains. She watched Julian adjust his tie in a nearby mirror, a man in love with his own reflection. He strode toward the podium, the applause swelling around him like a physical tide. He looked out over the audience, the board members, the city's elite, his mother, his trembling wife, and flashed a smile that was all teeth. "Ladies and gentlemen," Julian began, his voice amplified and booming through the high-fidelity speakers. "Tonight, we don't just celebrate 50 years of the Vance Foundation. We celebrate a rebirth. For too long, we have been held back by the cautious, dusty policies of the past. Tonight, I show you the new Vance legacy, a future built on bold moves and unprecedented growth." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a gold-plated thumb drive, holding it up like a trophy. Elena watched as he slotted it into the laptop integrated into the podium. "I've prepared a short presentation," Julian continued, his tone brimming with a smug, unearned confidence. "A transparent look at our new acquisitions and the massive returns I've secured for this foundation. This is the truth of our success." He tapped the enter key with a flourish. Behind him, a massive projector screen lowered from the ceiling, the white fabric unfurling like a shroud. The hum of the projector filled the sudden silence of the room. Elena felt her pulse thrumming in her fingertips, a rhythmic countdown. Julian turned toward the screen, his chest puffed out, waiting for the first slide of inflated numbers and fabricated charts to appear. He was smiling, his hand already reaching for his scotch to take a celebratory sip. The screen flickered, then stabilized. But it wasn't a graph that appeared. It was a high-resolution scan of a bank transfer authorization, one dated 3 months ago, showing a 7-figure sum moving from the foundation's endowment into a private offshore account in the Cayman Islands. Julian's name was at the bottom, the signature unmistakable. The room didn't just go quiet, it went vacuum-sealed. The only sound was the sharp, metallic clink of Julian's glass hitting the floor as his hand went limp. Elena stepped out from behind the curtain, the light from the projector catching the side of her face. She didn't say a word. She simply folded her arms and waited for him to turn around. The hum of the projector was the only sound in the cavernous ballroom, a mechanical drone that felt like a saw cutting through the suffocating silence. Julian Vance stood frozen, his hand still suspended in midair where his Scotch glass had been a second before. On the massive screen behind him, the bank authorization glowed in high definition, a digital ghost of his greed, casting a harsh, blue light over his expensive tuxedo. Elena Vance stepped fully into the light, her heels clicking against the polished marble with a finality that echoed like a gavel. She didn't look like the quiet ghostwriter who had spent years polishing his lies. She looked like the owner of the room. Julian finally turned, his movement slow and jerky, like a marionette with tangled strings. The transformation in his features was visceral. The smug, golden boy glow that had defined him for decades didn't just fade, it curdled. His skin, usually tanned to perfection from weekends at the club, drained of color until it matched the pale gray of the Foundation's letterhead. A fine sheen of cold sweat broke across his forehead, shimmering under the crystal chandeliers. His jaw didn't just drop, it hung slack, his bottom lip trembling with a rhythmic, uncontrollable twitch. His eyes, once bright with the arrogance of a man who thought himself untouchable, darted frantically toward the screen and back to Elena, the pupils blown wide with a primal, cornered animal terror. He looked smaller, the sharp lines of his designer suit suddenly appearing 2 sizes too large for a man who was shrinking in real time. "This is a mistake," he croaked, the sound scraping out of a throat that had suddenly gone bone dry. He looked toward the front row, his voice gaining a desperate, shrill edge. "Mother, you know Elena, she's always been jealous. She's doctored this. It's a fabrication." Beatrice Vance didn't move. Her hand was pressed hard against the hollow of her throat, her emerald ring catching the light as she stared at the screen. The disappointment on her face was a physical weight, a silent condemnation that hit harder than any shout. Beside her, Clara Vance had gone completely still, a single tear tracking through her perfect makeup, her eyes fixed on the signature at the bottom of the transfer. The signature she had seen on 1,000 birthday cards and mortgage documents. Marcus Thorne stood at the edge of the stage, his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on the board members who were already huddled in frantic, hushed whispers. The CFO was already on her phone, her face grim as she pointed toward the screen. The socialites who had been laughing at Julian's jokes moments ago were now physically leaning away from him, a collective receding tide that left him isolated in the center of the floor. "It's not a fabrication, Julian," Elena said, her voice low and perfectly steady, cutting through his rising panic. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. "The original documents are already with the auditors, along with the recordings of your calls to the Cayman accounts." She reached into her small clutch and pulled out a single, heavy brass key, the key to the Vance estate office that he had tried to lock her out of just 3 days ago. She set it on the edge of the podium with a sharp, metallic clack. Julian lunged forward, a desperate attempt to grab her arm, but Marcus stepped into his path with the silent efficiency of a wall. Julian stumbled back, his breath coming in ragged, wet hitches. "You can't do this. I am the face of this family." "Without me, you're nothing but a shadow." Elena looked at him, and for the first time in her life, she felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no hurt, just the cold clarity of a debt finally settled. "You called me a shadow, Julian," she said, her voice carrying to the very back of the room. "But shadows only exist when there's a light. Tonight, I've simply turned yours off." She didn't wait for his response. She didn't stay to watch the security guards, who were already moving toward the stage, or to hear Beatrice finally find her voice. She turned on her heel and walked toward the grand exit, the scent of the lilies following her out into the cool, honest night air. The heavy mahogany doors had barely clicked shut behind Elena Vance when the silence in the ballroom fractured into 1,000 jagged pieces. Behind her, the muffled roar of 100 hushed conversations ignited like a brushfire. She didn't stop. She didn't look back. Her heels struck the cold marble of the foyer with the rhythmic precision of a ticking clock, each step distancing her from the wreckage of the life she had once shared with her brother. Elena! Elena, stop. Julian Vance's voice was a ragged, desperate thing, stripped of the smooth, oily charm that had been his trademark for decades. He burst through the double doors, stumbling as he tried to catch up to her. He looked less like the heir to a dynasty and more like a man who had just watched his house slide into the sea. She stopped near the grand staircase, turning slowly. The light from the crystal chandelier above caught the sharp edges of her face, casting her in a glow that felt less like warmth and more like forged steel. Julian halted 3 feet away, his chest heaving. The arrogance that had been his armor didn't just crack, it disintegrated before her eyes. His skin had taken on a gray, waxy sheen, like a corpse in a designer suit. A frantic pulse throbbed in his temple, a trapped animal trying to claw its way out of his skull. His mouth hung open, a silent, dark void where his clever lies usually lived, and his eyes, once sharp with predatory intent, were now glazed and unfocused, darting around the room for an escape that no longer existed. He looked diminished, his expensive shoulders sagging as if the very fabric of his tuxedo had become too heavy to bear. "You can't do this," he wheezed, his hands shaking so violently he had to shove them into his pockets. "The board, they'll listen to me. I'll tell them the documents were forged. I'll tell them you're unstable." "The documents are already in the hands of the district attorney, Julian," a new voice cut through the air. Marcus Thorne stepped out from the shadows of the library, flanked by 2 men in dark, understated suits. He held a leather-bound folder with the family crest embossed on the cover, the same crest Julian had used to shield his crimes. Marcus didn't look at Julian with anger. He looked at him with the clinical detachment of a man disposing of a nuisance. "Everything has been verified," Marcus said, his voice echoing in the vast space. "The embezzlement, the offshore accounts, the signatures you forged on your mother's medical directives, it's all there. And the board has already held an emergency vote. You were removed from the chair 5 minutes ago." Julian spun around, looking for an ally, but the doors opened again. Beatrice Vance stood there, supported by Clara Vance. The matriarch's face was a mask of cold, brittle grief. She looked at her son as if she were seeing a stranger, or perhaps finally seeing the monster she had spent years pretending didn't exist. "Mother," Julian gasped, reaching out a hand. "You know Elena, she's always been jealous. She's trying to tear us apart." Beatrice didn't move toward him. Instead, she took a trembling step toward Elena. "I spent 20 years looking for your father in his eyes," the older woman whispered, her voice cracking. "I was so busy looking for a ghost that I didn't see the devil standing right in front of me." Clara, Julian's wife, let out a sharp, bitter laugh that sounded like breaking glass. She reached up and unclasped the diamond necklace Julian had given her for their anniversary, the one he'd bought with funds stolen from the estate's employee pension fund. She let it drop. It hit the marble with a dull, metallic thud. "I'm leaving, Julian," Clara said, her eyes red but her voice steady. "And I'm taking the children. Don't bother calling. The lawyers will be the only ones talking to you from now on." The witnesses who had filtered out of the ballroom, the city's elite, the people Julian had spent his life trying to impress, stood in a semicircle, watching the collapse. No one moved to help him. No one spoke in his defense. They simply watched, their faces a gallery of disgust and morbid curiosity. The social currency Julian had traded in his entire life had just hit zero. Julian looked at the circle of faces, then back at Elena. "You think you've won." He hissed, a final, pathetic spark of venom returning to his tone. "You've destroyed the family name. You've burned it all down." "No, Julian," Elena said, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried further than his shout. "I didn't burn it down. I just let the light in. You're the one who turned out to be made of straw." She turned to Marcus, who gave her a single, solemn nod. The 2 men in suits stepped forward, placing themselves on either side of Julian. They didn't use handcuffs, not yet, but the way they stood made it clear that his freedom was now a matter of minutes, not hours. Elena walked toward the massive front doors. The scent of lilies followed her, but it no longer smelled like a funeral. It smelled like a beginning. She reached the threshold and felt the cool night air hit her face, crisp and honest. "Elena!" Julian screamed behind her, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror as the reality of the cold, iron bars ahead finally settled into his bones. "Elena, come back! You can't leave me like this!" She didn't pause. She didn't offer him the satisfaction of a final glance. She stepped out into the night, the heavy doors of the Vance estate swinging shut for the last time behind her, leaving Julian alone in the silence of his own making. 6 months had passed since the heavy oak doors of the Vance estate had swung shut on the life Elena Vance used to know. The crisp October air now carried the scent of damp earth and wood smoke, a sharp, honest contrast to the cloying, artificial lilies that had once masked the rot of her brother's secrets. She stood on the west terrace, her fingers tracing the cool, rough stone of the balustrade. The house behind her was no longer a tomb of gambling debts and whispered betrayals. It was a sanctuary of light, the windows thrown open to invite the world back in. Marcus Thorne stepped onto the terrace, the rhythmic click of his shoes against the marble sounding like a heartbeat. He didn't speak at first, merely handing her a thick, cream-colored envelope. The texture of the vellum was heavy and expensive, bearing the embossed seal of the Vance Legacy Foundation. He leaned against the railing, his gaze following hers toward the manicured gardens where a group of scholarship students was currently touring the library. "The final audit came through this morning," Marcus said, his voice steady and devoid of the tension that had defined their lives for years. "The restitution is complete. Every cent Julian took has been accounted for and redirected into the endowment. You did it, Elena." Elena Vance took a slow breath, the air filling her lungs without the weight of a secret. "It doesn't feel like a victory," she admitted softly. "It feels like an ending." "It's both," Marcus replied. He checked his watch, a simple, functional piece, unlike the gold-plated monstrosities Julian used to flaunt. "I heard from the legal team in the city. His appeal was denied. He's moved into a state-mandated transitional unit. It's a far cry from the penthouse he thought he'd earned." Across the city, in a room that smelled of industrial floor wax and stale air, Julian Vance sat on the edge of a narrow cot. The designer silk shirts had long since been replaced by a scratchy, charcoal-gray uniform that made his skin itch. There was no mahogany desk here, no crystal tumblers of aged scotch, and certainly no one to laugh at his cruel jokes. His hands, once soft and manicured, were now calloused from the mandatory labor in the facility's laundry room. He stared at a small, cracked mirror on the wall, barely recognizing the man looking back. The arrogance had been bled out of him, replaced by a hollow, haunting silence. He reached for a phone that wasn't there, his thumb twitching from the ghost of a habit, before remembering that no one was waiting for his call. Clara Vance had made sure of that. She had moved to the coast, reclaiming her maiden name and the dignity she had nearly lost in the shadow of Julian's ego. She sent a postcard once a month to the estate, addressed only to Elena, filled with stories of the children's new school and the quiet peace of a life without lies. Elena turned back toward the house, her heels clicking with a newfound authority as she entered the sunroom. Beatrice Vance was there, seated in a high-backed chair by the window. Her mother looked smaller now, the formidable matriarchal armor replaced by a simple linen dress. She was holding a book, her eyes following the lines with a focus she hadn't possessed in years. She looked up as Elena entered, a small, tentative smile touching her lips. It was a fragile piece, built on the rubble of the family they had once been, but it was honest. "He called again last night," Beatrice said, her voice barely a whisper. "From the facility." Elena paused, her hand resting on the back of a chair. "Did you answer?" Beatrice shook her head slowly, a single tear tracing a path through the fine lines of her face. "No, I realized I didn't have anything left to say to him. I spent 30 years listening to his excuses, Elena. I think I'd like to listen to the birds for a while instead." The cost of the truth was etched into the silence between them. Elena had saved the estate, but she had lost the brother she thought she knew. She had gained a fortune, but she had lost the innocence that allowed her to believe in the inherent goodness of her own blood. She walked to the gallery wall where Julian's portrait had once hung. The space was now occupied by a large, vibrant landscape of the valley at dawn, a gift from the local artists' guild. She felt Marcus's presence behind her, a silent anchor in the shifting tides of her new life. The rage that had fueled her for so long had finally cooled into something else, a quiet, enduring strength. She wasn't a ghostwriter anymore. She was the author of her own story, and for the first time she knew exactly how it ended. Elena looked out the window one last time, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The shadows were long, but they no longer felt like threats. She reached out and switched off the gallery lights, leaving the past to the darkness while she walked toward the warmth of the living room, her footsteps echoing in a house that finally felt like home.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.